A reading from Romans chapter 2, verse 12 through chapter 3, verse 20. For all who have sinned without the law will also perish without the law, and all who have sinned under the law will be judged by the law. For it is not the hearers of the law who are righteous before God, but the doers of the law who will be justified. For when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them on that day when, according to my gospel, God judges the secrets of men by Christ Jesus. But if you call yourself a Jew and rely on the law and boast in God, and know his will and approve what is excellent, because you are instructed from the law, and if you are sure that you yourself are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of children, having in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth, you then who teach others, do you not teach yourself? While you preach against stealing, do you steal? You who say that one must not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who boast in the law dishonor God by breaking the law. For, as it is written, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. For circumcision indeed is of value if you obey the law, but if you break the law, your circumcision becomes uncircumcision. So, if a man who is uncircumcised keeps the precepts of the law, will not his uncircumcision be regarded as circumcision? Then he who is physically uncircumcised but keeps the law will condemn you who have the written code and circumcision but break the law. For no one is a Jew who is merely one outwardly, nor is circumcision outward and physical. But a Jew is one inwardly, and circumcision is a matter of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the letter. His praise is not from man, but from God. Then what advantage has the Jew? Or what is the value of circumcision? Much in every way. To begin with, the Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God. What if some were unfaithful? Does their faithlessness nullify the faithfulness of God? By no means. Let God be true, though every one were a liar, as it is written, that you may be justified in your words and prevail when you are judged. But if our unrighteousness serves to show the righteousness of God, what shall we say? That God is unrighteous to inflict wrath upon us? I speak in a human way. By no means, for then how could God judge the world? But if through my lie God's truth abounds to his glory, why am I still being condemned as a sinner? And why not do evil that good may come, as some people slanderously charge us with saying? Their condemnation is just. What then? Are we Jews any better off? No, not at all. For we have already charged that all, both Jews and Greeks, are under sin. As it is written, no one is righteous, no, not one. No one understands, no one seeks for God. All have turned aside, together they have become worthless. No one does good, not even one. Their throat is an open grave, they use their tongues to deceive. The venom of asps is under their lips. Their mouth is full of curses and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. In their paths are ruin and misery, and the way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be stopped, and the whole world may be held accountable to God. For by the works of the law, no human being will be justified in his sight, since through the law comes knowledge of sin. This is God's word.
Here in his letter to the Romans, the Apostle Paul, former church persecutor turned apostle and church planter, is building a case for the supremacy of the gospel, which is the good news about the saving accomplishments of God through his Son, Jesus Christ. The good news about the saving accomplishments of God through his Son, Jesus Christ. And Paul is looking forward to visiting Rome, the people to whom he's writing, where he plans to strengthen the church by preaching the gospel. For, he says in verses 16 and 17, I am not ashamed of the gospel, of the good news, of the saving accomplishments of God through his Son, Jesus Christ. For in that good news, the power of God for salvation is revealed to Jews and to the Greeks. It's revealed from faith and for faith, because it's in that gospel that the righteousness of God is revealed. So the Apostle Paul summarizes basically the whole of his message by saying, God saves us with his own righteousness. And we tap into that righteousness by faith. But Paul knows that when he says that there's something inside of every one of us that objects. We object to being saved in that way. We, along with all the ancient peoples, whether pagan or Jew, all of us are self-justifiers. I'll demonstrate the point this way. There is a quarry with a rope swing in my hometown where a group of us would often go swimming in the summers after football practice. And the thing about a quarry, if you don't know, is that there isn't a gradual gradation or slope into the water. You step off into the water and it's straight down, scarily so. And that's how we discovered that one of our largest teammates did not know how to swim. It was his turn on the rope swing, and supposing that this was just like any other swimming hole, he swung out on the swing, not too far, thinking that he would be able to stand. It took a few moments for us to realize that he was not swimming. He was flailing. And my cousin, who is a strong swimmer, nearly drowned himself trying to get our friend back to the shore. Why was it so hard to save him? Because drowning people flail to try and stay above water. And when it comes to the waterline of the righteousness of God, the Apostle Paul is saying, we are all flailing on our way to drowning. He begins to demonstrate that point with the Greeks. He points to not only the moral bankruptcy of their societies, but also to their own lack of morality personally, both corporately and individually. He's saying to them, your paganism has failed you. It's failed to create a beautiful world. It has failed you personally. And that's because you're under the wrath of God. You're flailing. And then he turns his sights, we saw last week, on the Jews, his own countrymen. They know the truth about God because God has shown them the truth of himself. Beginning with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all the way down to Moses, the Jews have the law of God. They have the revelation of God. They have what Paul calls the oracles of God. They have the Bible. And yet, they were inventing a religion inside of the revelation that they had been given. Paul calls it the law. They're trying to use the law to swim to shore. And Paul is saying to them, not only is that not why God gave you the law, but even if God had given you the law to do that, you yourselves prove that you have failed. Why? Because your neighbors don't think well of God. And if you had succeeded in living up to the law of God, then your neighbors would not profane your God. So the Gentiles are failing at righteousness with the flailing strategy of paganism. But the Jews are in no better of a position. They are failing at righteousness with the flailing strategy of legalism. But what's the point in pointing that out? Is Paul just fed up with pagans and Jews? No. Paul's highlighting their failure because he wants them to give up on something. He wants them to give up on flailing for their own righteousness. He wants them to give up finally and decisively on self-justification and to receive Jesus Christ at a deeper level than ever before. He's speaking to both unbelievers and believers, Jews and Greeks. And here's what that shows us. The gospel of Jesus Christ is not a technique from God for gaining righteousness, like swimming lessons. The gospel of Jesus Christ is the saving righteousness of God applied to us by God Himself, like being rescued from drowning. But you might say, what does that have to do with us? We're Christians. Last week, we unpacked Paul's prosecution of Jewish legalism, and we look at that and we think, yeah, that's right, but what does that have to do with us? Well, we didn't have very much time last week to apply that teaching to us today, so what I want to do this morning for us is what Paul is doing for the Jews. I want to prosecute Christian legalism in the way that Paul was prosecuting the legalism of his day. Why? Because wouldn't it be great? Wouldn't it be great to feel the smile of God, the fatherly, committed, never turning back smile of God upon us in Jesus Christ? We all want that. And we have that to the degree, in our experience, to the degree that we stop flailing and let Jesus Christ swim us to shore. So, we must be saved from flailing Christian legalism to Christ Himself. Now, 3 questions to help us through. Firstly, what is Christian legalism? That matters because we're prone to drift just as much as any generation before us. So we need to know what Christian legalism is. Secondly, why doesn't Christian legalism work? That's the second question I want to ask. Because if we're not convinced of the failure of self-justification, then we have a hard time giving up on it. And then thirdly, what can save us from Christian legalism? That matters because we tend to move from one legalism to the next. So, what is Christian legalism? Why doesn't it work? And what can save us? Firstly, what is it? Notice verses 19 and 20. Chapter 3, now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law. That's a key phrase for the Apostle Paul, under the law. So that every mouth may be stopped and the whole world may be held accountable to God. For by works of the law, no human being will be justified in God's sight, since through the law comes knowledge of sin. Now, some of us here are new to Christianity. We haven't been Christians very long, and you might be wondering what in the world this is, this Christian legalism. So I want to offer a definition of Christian legalism based on this teaching in Romans, and here is the simplest and broadest way that I can think to put it. Christian legalism is our tendency to foreground biblical morals and practices while backgrounding the saving accomplishments of Jesus Christ in the gospel. Christian legalism is our tendency to foreground biblical practices and morals and principles and to background the saving accomplishments of Jesus Christ. Now, let me unpack that. The reason that I use the word tendency and foreground and background is that there are just literally thousands of ways to slip into Christian legalism, but they all of them involve backgrounding the gospel and relating to God again on the basis of our accomplishments. I love the way that Martin Luther puts this somewhere. He says, I've been preaching this doctrine of justification by faith in the accomplishments of Christ. I've been preaching it and teaching it for more than 20 years. And yet still, he says, the old tenacious mire clings to me, so that I find myself wanting to come to God, bringing something in my hand for which he should bestow his grace upon me. All right, that something in our hand, that's Christian legalism. How do we slip into that? I'm helped by how Dr. D.A. Carson describes that reality in his wonderful little article, What is the Gospel? He says, when we treat the gospel as merely the way into the kingdom of God, the thing that gets us through the door, but then we act as though the real work of transformation depends on our own post-gospel disciplines, then functionally we've left the gospel behind. How? By changing our doctrinal statement? No. By foregrounding what is backgrounded in the gospel. He goes on to offer a litmus test, which I find very helpful. He says, the real question is not, do we believe that the gospel is true in our church? The real question is, what is your church excited about? Is it all the entailments of the gospel? All that we're going to do for the world, or all the evangelism strategies that we're going to run? Or is it Jesus Christ himself? Let me demonstrate the point this way. Imagine a man who says he's in love with a woman, but all he ever talks about are her vast holdings of property. We would all say that that's a self-interested relationship. He just wants her wealth. But now imagine a man who says he's in love with a woman, and he doesn't care about her money, but all he ever talks about is how she brings out his best qualities. Is that then a healthy relationship? No. That's just a more subtle form of self-interest. And that is Christian legalism. Christian legalism says, you know what I love about Jesus? He just knows how to bring out the best in me. At first, it looks and sounds like Christianity because we're talking a lot about Jesus and we're trying to live Christianly, but over time, it leads to posing and eventually to deconstruction. Why? Because when we foreground Jesus as our moral standard, as our mere life coach or our rabbi, then we create an even more impossible standard to live up to than the law of Moses. Because not only did Jesus keep the law perfectly, Jesus showed grace perfectly. Jesus is the embodiment of the law. Christian legalism is just legalism, ratcheted up to the standard of Jesus Christ. It's even more impossible. And it doesn't work any better than the old legalism, because it leaves us under the law. Now, let me build out a sidebar here. If what comes into your mind when I say the gospel or the accomplishments of Jesus Christ is primarily a past tense reality, then you are going to tend toward Christian legalism. In the New Testament, the salvation of God is spoken of in three tenses: past, present, and future. I don't even know how long ago it was, we preached a sermon series on the gospel. We called it the gospel in 3 dimensions, and we did so for that reason. Because if what comes into your mind when you hear the word gospel or salvation is primarily what Jesus did in the past, which is a third true, then you will tend today to feel as if the onus of your salvation is on you. But if you pay attention to the tenses of the gospel in the New Testament, you discover that not only did Jesus save us, Jesus is saving us, and Jesus is going to save us. That's why the Apostle Paul says that God's going to judge the secrets of men according to my gospel. In other words, there's an aspect of the gospel yet to be completed. The good news is that no one is getting away with anything. The good news is that all the things, as Tolkien put it, that everything sad is coming untrue. So, when we hear this word gospel and accomplishment, and what comes into our minds is not just what Jesus did in the past, but what Jesus is doing right now, namely interceding for us with the Father in heaven above, then it makes it a whole lot harder to be taken captive by those so-called Christian theologies, and they're inside of many best-selling books today that put the real work of salvation onto what we do after we come to Jesus. We just have to keep coming to Jesus. For instance, one of the probably best theologians of the 20th century, J. Gresham Machen, who taught us so much about justification and about the past tense accomplishments of Jesus, on his deathbed sent a telegram to a friend, and here was how he was consoling himself dying of pneumonia. He said, "I am so thankful for the active obedience of Jesus Christ." In other words, not just what Jesus did back then, what Jesus is doing right now on my behalf before the Father. He died a Christian. So Christian legalism then is our tendency to foreground biblical morals and principles and practices while backgrounding the three-dimensional accomplishments of Jesus Christ in the gospel, which leads to a second question. Why doesn't Christian legalism work? We need to be convinced of this. We need to understand. Christian legalism doesn't work because it doesn't engage the heart with the gospel. Notice chapter 2 and verses 28 and 29. We're just working Paul's argument backwards. For no one is a Jew who is merely one outwardly, nor is circumcision outward and physical. Now that was a very provocative thing to say, because in fact, circumcision is literally outward, right? So what's Paul saying? He clarifies. But a Jew is one inwardly, and circumcision is a matter of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the letter. His praise, this is a key phrase, his praise is not from man, but from God. Now, we saw last week that Paul is simply using circumcision as an example of how the Jews were foregrounding the law in order to try to gain righteousness. But we could just as easily replace circumcision with church membership, for instance, to make the same point. The point is that our relationship to God is not primarily a matter of outward obedience, but of inward heart change. Now, we rarely use the word praise in the way that Paul's using it here. But both Peter and Paul use the word praise in this way, as something coming from God to us. This is striking. Now, here is the point that they're making. The gospel of Jesus Christ awakens in our hearts a natural and appropriate desire for the smile of God, the praise of God, the that-a-boy of God. That is, and this is the key part, that is independent from the approval of man. Independent, that's what he means when he says, not from man, but from God. It awakens in us a desire for the smile of God that is independent from the approval of others. Here's a way to think of it. This is, of course, you'll know, not theoretical. Imagine a wife who loves to go on trips with her husband, but she spends the whole time posting about their trip on social media. Now, on the one hand, we might say, well, that's great. She's really proud of her husband and their marriage, and she wants the world to know. Okay, that's good. That's appropriate. But on the other hand, if the trip in her mind would be a failure without social media documentation, then it's the first proof, that she cares more for the smile of others than of her husband. Why? Because it would prove that their relationship is not an end in itself. It's a means to something else. And it's just the same way with Christian legalism. It doesn't prioritize a heart-level relationship with God, which is independent from the approval of others. We all know that the man or woman who's just looking for an Instagram prop eventually ends up with just that. But in so doing, of course, we forfeit the deep and satisfying and intimate friendship shared between two people, so deep and so personal and so intimate that it has its own ecosystem of shared memories and inside jokes and unspeakable intimacy. And it's just the same way in our relationship with God. The deep and satisfying thing about Christianity is not all the ways that it changes us into better people or all the ways that it makes the world a better place. The deep and satisfying thing about Christianity is Christ. Christ himself. Jesus is the kind of friend, the kind of Savior who makes us want to cut the socials so that we don't miss a moment with him. Of course, we want to declare our love for him to the world, and we do. But the deep and the satisfying and the constant and the foregrounded reality is just to know him and to be with him and to behold him. That's the kind of Christianity that changed the world. In his book, Evangelism in the Early Church, Michael Green, probably one of the most prolific evangelists of the 21st century, points out that you hardly ever see the Great Commission, go into all the world and make disciples, etc. You hardly ever see the Great Commission quoted in the second century Christian literature. And here's the reason, he points out. Because they didn't need to emphasize the command to go and to make disciples. Actually, what stood out to them about that verse were these words: I am with you always. People who are with Jesus cannot help but bring people to Jesus. But people who foreground the command and background being with Jesus end up driving people from Jesus. Only Jesus Christ can save us from our Christianity. Because, number 3, he himself is the cure for Christian legalism. And now we work the argument back to its starting point, verses 16 and 17, chapter 1. For I am not ashamed of the gospel. Now we see why Paul planned to show up in Rome, where they were famous for their Christianity, and preach the gospel. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God. In other words, you Romans, you have not graduated beyond the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith. The gospel of Jesus Christ then is not a plan that we enact. It's a power that we receive. But to what end? A power to what end? We're in the process right now of remodeling a house. I don't recommend it. Currently, there are wires hanging about the house that aren't hooked up to any light fixtures. And of course, without the light fixtures, there's no lights in the house. But just hooking up the light fixtures does not mean that there will be lights in the house. All the wires can be in place, all the fixtures can be hooked up, but it can still be cold and dark on the inside. Why? Because the wires and the fixtures are pointless, really, without the power flowing through them. And friends, when it comes to righteousness, which is to say the heart level goodness that radiates life, when it comes to righteousness, we are powerless fixtures. That's the point of the litany of Old Testament verses in chapter 3 and verses 10 to 18. The Apostle Paul here is articulating the category that we Christians have come to call total depravity. By that, we don't mean that everybody's as bad as we could be. We mean there's no lights on inside of anybody. But Jesus Christ is the light. And his accomplishments, past, present, and future, are how the power of God surges into the people of God. We could spend a year of Sundays talking about all the various forms of Christian legalism in the world today. There are conservative kinds. There are liberal kinds. There are all kinds of Christian legalism. But the only thing that we would do is create a more pretentious Christian legalism in doing so. We would become ourselves Pharisees of Pharisees, knowing how everybody else is getting it wrong. Or we could just sidestep all of that tedium and double down on knowing Jesus Christ and just leave the running of Christianity to him. The devil, and there really is a devil, would really love to draw us into the scrutiny, the constant, just churning scrutiny of others, because it would turn our attention away from Christ. And the devil understands the irony of the gospel. He knows that when we make the enjoyment of Jesus Christ our first business, when we foreground the gospel of Jesus Christ, then the law of God, which is just to say the intuitions of God himself that are in themselves righteous, those become engraved on our hearts. In other words, we light up with the life of God as never before. The light of God, as it were, drives out the darkness within us. The porn addiction, the social media addiction, all of the addictions are driven out by the same remedy, namely Christ himself. And who doesn't need that? No matter where you are in your Christian life, you've been following Jesus for 40 years. Have you graduated beyond that? Now, I know that some of you feel, because we talk, I know that some of you feel as if you're not accomplishing much for Jesus. And it's a real temptation to foreground Christian practices, to just try to get some traction. You might think, I should be evangelizing my neighbors better. Or I ought to be reading my Bible more, or I should be at church more. And many of those things, perhaps even all of them, are true. They're true of me too. I ought to do better. But here's the thing. Jesus has never missed a day of church. Jesus has never failed to keep the law. Jesus has never failed to love his neighbors. Jesus is the photo negative or photo positive of all of the negative things that Paul says about us in chapter 3 in verses 10 to 18. He is righteous. He does understand God. He does seek his Father's will. He has not turned aside. He has not become worthless. He is good. His throat is not an open grave. He does not use his tongue to deceive. The venom of asps is not under his lips, but healing. His mouth is not full of curses and bitterness. His feet are not swift to shed blood, but to have his own blood shed. In his paths are not ruin and misery, but life everlasting. And the way of peace he knows. Therefore, you don't have to swim your way to shore. In a world of flailing for righteousness, he's God's only swimmer. And he will just take you there. He will take me there. He will take us there together. And we'll be saved. And the power of his gospel will fill our lives, however dimly. Our experience of the gospel right now is less like a toggle switch and more like a dimmer switch. It's just coming on slowly. But in the darkness of this world, even a dim light radiates. And you are right now already more radiant than you think. God is already doing more through you and with you and in you than you think. So just keep going. Just keep hanging on to Jesus.